According to Bloomberg rankings, South Africa now has the highest unemployment rate on a global list of 82 countries monitored by the financial publication. Yesterday, Statistics South Africa released the second quarter unemployment figures, which show that the country's unemployment rate hit a record high of 34.4% in the second quarter from 32.6% in the first 3 months of this year. Unemployment remains stubbornly high among the youth, with a third of the country's youth unable to find any jobs. Unemployed graduates constitute 11% of the unemployed, while those unemployed with a matric certificate constitute 23%. Now, this morning we speak to former Statistician-General Dr. Pali Lehohla to help us better understand these figures. Dr. Lehohla, always a pleasure having you. Thanks again for your time this morning.
No, thank you very much. A pensioner doesn't have to wake up so early. This is the time when we are dreaming about lotto numbers.
Yeah, this is it.
But nonetheless,
I know.
The nightmares of unemployment should take precedence.
It is. It really is, and I mean, this perhaps is one of the biggest crises we are going through right now as a country. I mean, in and amongst a lot of other things. But when you look at these unemployment figures moving higher and higher, it's nothing new. It's a story that we've been covering and looking at for quite some time. But when you took a look at what was released yesterday, what were your immediate views?
My immediate views are this. At the first quarter of this year, and in the State of the Nation address, the president said the jobs are coming back. And this was based on a study by Needs, which I already said those numbers were wrong. And the Statistician-General came and confirmed that these numbers were wrong. I'm making this point because I take exception that the highest policymakers in the country are hankering after good news, when actually the country is in a crisis of unemployment. And to imagine that the jobs are coming back on a needs study. Of course, needs crime is very important. National income dynamics program is very important. But when it comes to unemployment numbers, I don't know who is advising the president. So it is very, very, very disturbing to find that people are hankering after good news and not looking at the crisis in the face. And it starts with education. There again, we find the Minister of Education and the President saying the education is improving, the results are improving. They are not. So my problem is the seriousness with which our policies are made, are designed to answer the right questions. It is always better to have the correct question asked. Have an answer to the correct question. It's always much better than the right answer to the wrong question. And all the time, in the behavior of the president and the Minister of Education, and of course our policy space, we are answering the wrong questions all the time. That's the point.
Dr. Lehohla, I ask you a very blunt question because I think you touched on an issue that's very important. Who's advising the president? And, you know, trying to sell a happy picture where right now it's not a happy picture, and trying to create a perception that is not existing right now. So we were having a conversation saying that it cannot be business as usual. It cannot be. Things cannot be done the way that they were done many, many years ago, but nothing is changing. Is this government capable of changing the situation? That is the biggest question we need to answer right now. Are these the right people? Do we have the right people in charge that can assist this country?
Well, we have been in this space for 10 years. The frog has been boiling and now it's dead. They are not, to put it very bluntly. Because our policies are far removed from solving the problems that we have. I'm afraid they are not. The evidence is overwhelming that they cannot deal with the problems that we have. But these are the people we have. And we got to make do with what we have.
I mean,
so the question here is really, we've been chasing things like debt to GDP ratio. when we should be looking at poverty. I mean, yesterday we were discussing with Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and the president, former president of Bhutan was there, the former president of Costa Rica was there, and they said, if poverty is not a priority, then what is the priority? And they focused on this in their respective countries, and they've seen results. In South Africa, it doesn't look like we actually discuss or look at poverty. It's more rhetorical. Every statement, every state of the nation, everything starts with poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Yet we do nothing about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, the government of Paraguay, in terms of poverty, have Treasury, Reserve Bank, other ministries of economy focusing on poverty. And they meet every month to look at what happens to poverty. So we need focused attention on this thing. Short of that, I mean, if you look at how we have dealt with the 350 rands, we stop it and switch it on. It's as though people are an electric switch. Of course, a faulty one, given the shenanigans at ESCOM. You cannot do that with people. That today there's 350, then there's what is called insurrection in KwaZulu-Natal, then you put the 350 back. Yeah. It really can't be. It shows how shoddy we treat the poor. So there are fundamental problems. Look at the 300,000 people who are employed in education. We could have deployed those resources better in agriculture to ensure that there is food security, there are skills imparted in that space, not in education. Education is too sensitive to deploy 300,000 people that are not teachers to support teachers. And after all, the school system is not working. And because of Corona, people are not in school. So these 360,000 people are idling. But we could have chosen a different path and look at agriculture. So our choices are uninformed. Yeah.
And I mean, when we look
this is a problem.
It is a big problem. And I mean, you're identifying different sectors. So let's be practical now, because you've already come through with a couple of solutions. As you're saying, we're not going to change anything in terms of leadership right now. We've got the leaders. We now need to start shifting the focus of how we create jobs, how we create employment. So how do we do that? I know you're saying, you know, the unemployment sector is broken right now. The one where we saw some growth is agriculture. We saw some growth in manufacturing. Pretty much so everything else is down. I mean, the financial sector, I think we saw a loss of about almost 300,000 jobs in just manufacturing. I mean, altogether, 584,000 jobs were lost. I mean, these people are now, individuals sitting at home, not to mention how many people are now destitute because of them. But let's focus on industries. So if we focus attention into industries that we know are job creators, that are doing well, how do we start turning the tide? Where do we invest our time and money?
Well, first, we got to really look at our policy infrastructure. That is broken because it has not yielded results. That's the first thing that we have to strategically look at and focus on. Having done that, then we can look at how do that policy infrastructure design generates jobs. Of course, we've got to look at agriculture is one of those. Mining, we know that we are a mining country. We've got those. And manufacturing, we've got to bring back manufacturing. There's no
All right, let's just try and get that connection reestablished there to the former Statistician-General.
We must look at the macroeconomic. Have we lost me?
I did lose you for a second, but it seems that we have got your connection back. You can pick that up. We probably lost a few seconds rather.
I would say that we need to look at the policy infrastructure that we have. And that policy infrastructure needs structural reforms itself, because it is focusing only on structural reforms at the micro level, and it doesn't want to temper the macro structure. And we have modeled these things a number of times to show that unless we deal with the macro framework, South Africa is never going to get out of this. Davies himself, who was the Minister of Trade and Industry, said, unless we temper that macro, South Africa will always be suffocated in its desire to move. And then now with the pandemic, it gets worse. So we need agriculture, we need mining, of course, but we need to ensure that the macro system doesn't get so hung up on debt to GDP ratio, because debt to GDP ratio is resolved by growth. And if the economy doesn't grow, as it doesn't at the moment, even if we do all those micro reforms, we can only achieve 3% growth. And that 3% growth is going to create 29% unemployment, is going to leave poverty levels where it is, and by 2030 we'll be basically where we are. So we are sold a lemon here by policymakers. And they're not willing to shift to realize that what they are proposing is a real Guarabara situation, which in the scenarios we have already articulated. So what we need from the space of policy is a socially desirable end. And that socially desirable end means a cohesive South Africa that has employment and everything, led by a politically stimulating situation and through an economically viable process. Neither of those are in place in South Africa at the moment, and we need to get those as quickly as possible. Because without socially cohesive society, people, Now, yesterday we were discussing with Tebe Foundation, and in there were some businessmen who were saying, look, we realize that we can no longer function in the way we function. We need to get communities to be activated. So social, civil society and business have to come to the fore. But unfortunately, what you see is that Business for South Africa presented a list of things to government to consider. And government hasn't considered that. Why? Because they don't have instruments by which they can actually consider that. So we are faltering from one scandal to the next. And the pandemic is, so it is very, very important to get the necessary tools that enable us to do the things that we have to do. You cannot plan a country the size and complexity of South Africa on the back of a cigarette box. And that's what we are faced with in this country.
A quotable quote there. You mentioned something very interesting, that the government, obviously, at a national level, is responsible for policy. But you talk to provincial and local spheres where there are people and programs. That's where job creation should be centered, because this is on the ground. This is where we see the heart of what's going on. What must change there? Because that perhaps maybe is where we must see a lot of things changing.
Well, we don't have the people with the skills to run even local government. The IDPs, are not worth the paper they are written on. We critique this as a say for many a time. And unless you get people who are skilled to do that. However, skill is one thing, good intentions is another. But we have seen audit after audit, the intention to steal predominates everything else. So even if you have bad plans, good intentions can always mitigate bad plans. But when you have bad plans and bad intentions, then you really have a Guarabara situation. So people who have stolen must march to prison immediately. There's no other thing that can fix this country unless law enforcement is law enforcement. Because even now as we talk, people intend to steal at the slightest opportunity. And because we don't have systems of planning, systems of monitoring and evaluation, people take advantage of this, and they want to get their bit before that big tail of the crocodile comes. So we are in a real serious fix. And our hankering for spin and good news to tell is a big problem in the absence of fundamental systems that are etched in evidence and handle the planning, focusing on the poorest of the poor. That's the government business. We look at, and Dr. Lehohla, here's where the worry comes in, and what we saw in terms of the so-called insurrection that took place in South Africa in July. And those were scenes that we never imagined we'd see in South Africa, and we pray never to see again in South Africa. However, it did lay bare
the desperation of South Africans, because whatever was behind it and whatever was fueling it, the reality is behind a lot of it was desperation. People running rampant, there was no control, nobody could stop them. But the reality is that, I mean, we saw Treasury being briefed as to exactly what this did to South Africa. It'll take at least 2 years to recover, and 51% of those businesses that have been destroyed through that are not even going to reopen, and that's the reality of the jobs, which we haven't even seen in this quarter, that are being lost. The danger of such a high unemployment rate in the country and such dissatisfaction amongst people. What is going to happen if something urgently is not done?
Well, it's not. Something has not been done for a number of years. So it's too late now to talk about if something urgently not done. When I talked to people and said we must plan, they said we have too many plans and there is not time to plan. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And unless you have deployed the right tools in the plan, including emergency ones, but a serious plan, not a back of the cigarette box plans that have generated some emergency prospects for during this COVID-19, like getting 300,000 people in schools. It shows that there was thoughtlessness, or even better, or even still, saying that we will destroy the loot because it is going to depress the prices. I mean, that's thoughtlessness at the level of cabinet. I'm afraid that there's just too much thoughtlessness and lack of advice from the bureaucrats. And we need to get back to that, to understand what needs to be done. Of course, the first thing is to shift towards good intentions, because good intentions to get us out of where we are what is necessary. And good intentions will be reinforced by sending to the wrongdoers to a jail sooner rather than later, because it will stimulate and anchor those who have good intentions, and we can see better. Rwanda and South Africa were born on the same day. If anybody said South Africa will be where it is today in 1994, that was a deserving story for Rwanda, not for South Africa. Yet Rwanda came out much better and tops of the continent when South Africa is reeling towards where Rwanda was in 1994.
All right, we unfortunately have to leave it there. Former Statistician-General Dr. Pali Lehohla discussing the state of joblessness in South Africa following a Stats SA report that the country's unemployment rate is now at a record high of 34.4% and is sitting at the top of the list when it comes to the globe in terms of unemployment rates. I mean, below us is the likes of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Nigeria sitting at 27.1%. And at this point, we are at 34.4%. All right, that's leading us into 7 o'clock here.